We have documented evidence of expense fraud totaling $1,847 in unauthorized travel expenditures. Bradley Simmons delivered this accusation with barely concealed satisfaction. His face filled my laptop screen while 43 colleagues watched in stunned silence. 3 weeks as HR director. 3 weeks of proving himself through terminations rather than competence. And I was his biggest target. Effective immediately, your employment with Vertex Aviation Systems is terminated. Your access credentials have been revoked. Security will coordinate retrieval of company property. 43 faces in tiny Zoom rectangles, some shocked, some confused, a few looking away, unable to witness the execution. I said nothing. Not because I was devastated, not because I was scrambling for excuses, because I knew something Bradley Simmons clearly didn't. I closed my laptop gently, poured fresh coffee, pulled up my personal files and found exactly what I needed. FAA Form 8130-3, signed by Federal Aviation Administration Inspector Theodore Walsh, time-stamped 4:47 p.m. on what Bradley had called my unauthorized third day in Albuquerque. The form that documented federally mandated compliance activities. The form that proved every single expense Bradley flagged as fraud was actually required by federal law. I attached it to an email, along with 3 supporting documents: added recipients, General Counsel, VP of Operations, FAA Liaison, and Bradley Simmons himself. Subject line: Termination, Federal Compliance Documentation attached. I pressed send at 9:51 a.m. At 10:23 a.m., legal called the executive team. Those expenses Lauren submitted, they were federally mandated for Part 21 compliance, every single line item. Who exactly did you just fire? Richard Holloway, founder, CEO, the man who'd built Vertex from nothing, went completely white. Because they'd just terminated their only FAA credentialed quality inspector, 19 days before a federal compliance review. The $2.8 million fine arrived 6 weeks later, and Bradley Simmons learned exactly how much his incompetence actually cost. Now, before I walk you through exactly what happened after legal made that call, and trust me, watching Bradley realize the magnitude of his mistake was absolutely priceless, I need to pause here. If you've ever been publicly accused of something by someone who didn't understand your job, if you've ever watched incompetence get promoted while expertise got ignored, if you've ever had documentation so thorough that accusations crumbled the moment someone actually reviewed it, you belong here. We share real experiences from people who were underestimated until the evidence spoke louder than the accusations. We're building something meaningful, a community that celebrates preparation, documentation, and the satisfaction of watching arrogance meet consequences. If you're among the first 1,000 subscribers, you're laying the foundation with us. That button is right there. Now, let me explain the 7 years that led to the most expensive wrongful termination in Vertex Aviation's history. My name is Lauren Castellano. I'm 38 years old, happily dating a wonderful man named Derek for the past 2 years, and until that Zoom call, I was the Senior Quality Assurance Coordinator at Vertex Aviation Systems, a company that manufactured safety-critical aerospace components for commercial and military aircraft. This is the account of how a 3-week HR director accused me of fraud over expenses he didn't understand, and why that accusation cost his company millions and ended his career before it really began. Aviation manufacturing exists at the intersection of precision engineering and federal oversight. The components we produced at Vertex, brackets, fasteners, structural elements, went into aircraft that carried thousands of passengers daily. A single defective part could cause catastrophic failure at 30,000 feet. The stakes shaped everything about how I approached my work. I discovered this field almost accidentally. After completing my engineering degree, I spent 4 years in general manufacturing quality control. Decent work, but something felt missing. Then I attended an industry conference where an FAA inspector spoke about aviation compliance. The rigor, the documentation requirements, the understanding that every signature represented personal accountability for human lives. I was hooked immediately. I pursued every certification available, completed the FAA's quality representative training, earned my Part 21 designations that authorized me to conduct supplier audits and sign compliance documentation on behalf of the agency. Vertex Aviation recruited me at 31, specifically because those credentials were exceptionally rare. Lauren, we manufacture components for 16 different aircraft platforms, Richard Holloway explained during my interview. The FAA trusts maybe 200 people in the entire country to conduct the kind of audits you're qualified for. We need someone who can protect our certifications while our competitors struggle to find qualified personnel. The work requires significant travel, supplier audits across multiple states, documentation that can withstand federal scrutiny. Travel is expected, documentation is required. I want someone who treats both as non-negotiable. I joined Vertex believing I'd found leadership that understood compliance work. For 6 years, that belief seemed accurate. Building quality systems at an aviation manufacturer demands particular obsession with detail. Every supplier audit I conducted followed protocols established by federal regulation. Every expense I submitted corresponded to activities mandated by our Part 21 production approval certificate. Every signature I provided carried legal weight that extended far beyond corporate paperwork. I documented everything meticulously, not because I expected to be accused of fraud, because aviation quality assurance requires documentation that can reconstruct decisions years after they're made. Crash investigations sometimes examine maintenance records from a decade earlier. The signatures matter. The timestamps matter. The trail of accountability matters. My expense reports reflected this same precision. Flights booked to specific supplier locations identified in our FAA-approved quality plan, hotels near facilities requiring multi-day audits, meals within per diem guidelines, occasionally adjusted when work extended beyond normal hours, shipping costs for components requiring expedited laboratory analysis, every line item traceable to regulatory requirements. Richard understood this implicitly. He'd built Vertex from a small machine shop into a major aerospace supplier by respecting the compliance frameworks that governed the industry. "Your work keeps us certified," he told me during year 3. "Everything else we do depends on maintaining those approvals. Don't ever let anyone pressure you into cutting corners." Corners in aviation compliance create body counts. Exactly why I hired you. That mutual understanding sustained me through demanding travel schedules and complex audit situations. Derek entered my life during year 5. We met through a hiking group. He worked as a software developer, methodical in ways that complemented my systematic approach to everything. "You actually enjoy expense reports," he observed during one of our early dates, watching me organize receipts with apparent satisfaction. "I enjoy documentation that protects me when someone questions my work." Has anyone ever questioned your work? Not successfully, because the documentation is always complete. I had no idea how thoroughly that principle would be tested.
Bradley Simmons arrived at Vertex like a weather system nobody had forecast. Richard Holloway had begun stepping back from daily operations during my 6th year. Health concerns, family priorities, the natural arc of someone who'd worked relentlessly for 3 decades. The company needed stronger HR infrastructure for eventual leadership transition. Bradley came with impressive credentials on paper. MBA from a respected program, 5 years in human resources at a manufacturing company, references that spoke to his ambition. What nobody assessed properly was whether his previous experience translated to federally regulated environments. It didn't. His first month involved aggressive auditing of department budgets, not strategic review, adversarial examination designed to identify waste and demonstrate his value through cost reduction. Quality assurance landed on his radar immediately. "Lauren, I've been reviewing your department's expenditures. Travel costs seem disproportionately high compared to other functions." "My travel is mandated by federal regulation. Every trip corresponds to supplier audits required under our Part 21 certification." "Required by whom specifically?" "The FAA, through our Production Approval Holder Agreement. Audits must occur at specified intervals, conducted by credentialed inspectors. I'm your only credentialed inspector." Bradley's expression suggested he didn't fully absorb this explanation. "Perhaps we should discuss optimizing audit schedules. Remote verification might reduce travel needs." "Remote verification isn't permitted for the compliance activities I conduct. Physical presence is federally required." "That seems inefficient." "Efficiency isn't the primary concern when certifying safety-critical aviation components." He ended that conversation without apparent understanding of what I'd explained. I documented our exchange immediately. Something about his approach triggered instincts I'd developed over years of protecting compliance systems from people who didn't understand them. The Albuquerque audit became Bradley's weapon 3 weeks later. Our supplier there manufactured brackets used in wing assemblies, components that experienced significant stress during flight operations. Regular audits ensured their manufacturing processes maintained required tolerances. My scheduled 2-day visit extended to 3 days when I discovered corrosion indicators on material samples that required additional testing. Standard protocol for the situation: document the finding, conduct supplementary analysis, resolve the issue before signing compliance certification. The extension added expenses: 1 additional hotel night, expedited shipping for samples requiring laboratory analysis, meals for the extra day. Everything within my authorization as a designated quality representative. I filed the expense report upon returning, documented the audit findings separately, and moved on to the next compliance activity. Bradley reviewed my expenses 2 weeks later. He saw the extension as unauthorized, the hotel night as excessive, the shipping costs as suspicious, the meal charges as pattern evidence of fraud. He didn't contact me for clarification, didn't consult with operations about audit protocols, didn't verify whether the extension served legitimate business purposes. He built a termination case and scheduled a company-wide Zoom meeting to execute it publicly. Richard Holloway apparently approved the decision without detailed review, trust in his new HR director, confidence that proper vetting had occurred. Neither assumption proved accurate. The Zoom call notification appeared on my calendar the morning of my termination. All hands update, HR announcement, scheduled for 45 minutes, mandatory attendance marked for every department. I joined expecting routine policy updates, benefits changes perhaps, new procedures from the ambitious new HR director. Instead, Bradley's face filled the screen with barely concealed satisfaction. "I've called this meeting to address a serious personnel matter regarding expense accountability and company resources." 43 colleagues watched from their small video rectangles. "Our review has identified significant irregularities in travel expense documentation submitted by Lauren Castellano, Senior Quality Assurance Coordinator." My heart rate increased slightly, not from fear, from recognition of what was happening. Specifically, a recent expense report totaling $1,847.63 includes charges that appear unauthorized and unsupported, an extra hotel night without approval, expedited shipping costs without documented justification, meal expenses exceeding standard allocations. He displayed my expense report on the shared screen,
highlighted each line item like evidence in a criminal prosecution. This pattern suggests financial misconduct inconsistent with company values and policies. I remained silent. Let him continue building his case. Effective immediately, Lauren's employment is terminated. Access credentials have been revoked. Security will coordinate return of company property. The silence that followed stretched uncomfortably. Some colleagues typed shocked messages in the chat. Others simply stared. A few, the ones who understood compliance work, looked horrified for reasons Bradley couldn't comprehend. I unmuted my microphone. "Thank you for clarifying your position, Bradley. I'll respond through appropriate channels." Then I left the meeting. Derek was working from home that morning. He found me in the kitchen, calmly brewing coffee, scrolling through files on my laptop. What just happened? I heard bits of that call. Bradley Simmons terminated me for expense fraud, publicly, in front of 43 colleagues. What? That's insane. Your expenses are documented more thoroughly than anything I've ever seen. Bradley doesn't understand what documentation exists or what it means. So what are you going to do? Send an email that's going to ruin his career. I pulled up the file I'd already located, FAA Form 8130-3, the authorized release certificate that Inspector Theodore Walsh had signed during my Albuquerque audit, the form that existed because the third day actually happened, the form that documented federally required activities, the form that proved every expense Bradley flagged as fraud was legally mandated. I composed my email carefully. "Good morning. Please find attached the FAA Authorized Release Certificate for the supplier audit in Albuquerque. This documentation is part of our Part 21 Continuous Airworthiness Program under 14 CFR Section 21.139. All expenses in my submitted report represent required federal compliance activities. The audit extension was necessitated by material findings requiring additional verification per our quality procedures. Failure to complete this audit appropriately risks suspension of Vertex Aviation's production approval certificate. I trust this clarifies any confusion regarding the nature of my work." I added recipients: General Counsel Rebecca Morrison, VP of Operations, FAA Liaison, and Bradley Simmons. Subject line: Termination, Federal Compliance Documentation attached. Then I pressed send. 9:51 a.m. The response arrived faster than I'd anticipated. At 10:23 a.m., 32 minutes after my email, an urgent company-wide notification went out. Immediate, compliance documentation review required. All department heads confirm status of ongoing FAA oversight activities. Potential gap in Part 21 program identified. Mandatory leadership call at 11 a.m. I wasn't invited to that call, but colleagues kept me informed through careful text messages. Rebecca Morrison, the General Counsel, had reviewed my documentation and immediately recognized the catastrophe Bradley had created. The Albuquerque audit was federally mandated, she reportedly said during the emergency meeting. The extension was required per our quality procedures. The expenses were legally obligated compliance costs, and we just terminated our only FAA credentialed inspector. Silence. So the fraud allegations were completely incorrect, based on zero investigation announced publicly without any verification of facts. What happens now? Now we have an incomplete audit but must be filed with the FAA within 30 days, and nobody authorized to sign the documentation. Can we hire someone else? FAA credential approval takes 4 to 6 weeks minimum, longer with expedited processing, and we have a compliance review scheduled in 19 days. More silence. What happens if inspectors arrive and find a gap in our program? Rebecca's response, according to my source: they place our production approval certificate on hold. no manufacturing, no shipments, no revenue, until the gap is resolved to their satisfaction. Bradley apparently attempted damage control immediately afterward. His email to leadership, sent at 12:17 p.m., after reviewing new information, there may have been a miscommunication regarding the circumstances of today's termination. Recommend discussing a path forward with Ms. Castellano. Rebecca's reply, copied to Richard Holloway and every executive, rescinding the termination exposes us to significant liability. Her credentials are personal certifications, not company property. She has no obligation to assist unless formally engaged. Do not contact her directly. All communication must go through legal. The panic escalated over the following hours. Richard Holloway called my personal phone at 2:15 p.m. I let it go to voicemail. His message sounded strained. Lauren, there seems to have been a significant misunderstanding this morning. I'd like to discuss the situation directly. Please call me back at your earliest convenience. I texted back, any discussion must go through my legal counsel. I didn't have legal counsel yet, but I would within hours. A firm called Brennan and Mitchell had recruited me periodically over the years. Aviation compliance specialists were rare, and they'd wanted to add aerospace quality consulting to their practice. I called their managing partner, Catherine Brennan, that afternoon. I saw the industry chatter when I explained the situation. Word travels fast when someone gets publicly terminated, and it turns out their termination just torpedoed their company's FAA certification. I need representation. You need more than representation. I'm making you an offer. Full partnership track, signing bonus, we handle your legal case pro bono, and you lead the consulting proposal we're about to send your former employer. Consulting proposal? They need you to fix their compliance gap before federal inspectors arrive, and you're the only person who can. We're going to charge them appropriately for that service. How appropriately? $85,000 for 3 weeks of work, non-negotiable terms, including a public apology from executive leadership. I accepted before she finished the sentence. The proposal landed in Rebecca Morrison's inbox that evening. 3 weeks of consulting services, completion of outstanding compliance documentation, preparation for the scheduled FAA review. Payment terms, 50% upon signing, 50% upon successful completion. Non-negotiable conditions included formal retraction of the fraud allegations and written apology from executive leadership. Rebecca responded within hours, her desperation barely concealed in professional language. Could we begin immediately? Could terms be modified? Could the apology be handled privately? Catherine replied from dinner, terms are non-negotiable. Proposal expires in 48 hours. Rates increase after that. Derek and I celebrated with champagne that evening. They accused you of fraud in front of the entire company, he said, still processing the day's events, and now they're going to pay you almost your annual salary to fix what they broke. Bradley Simmons wanted to make an example. He just chose the wrong person. Is this revenge? This is market value. I'm the only person who can solve their problem before federal inspectors arrive. The price reflects that scarcity. The contract was executed the following afternoon. Wire transfer confirmed by end of business. At 4 p.m., I received a calendar invitation. Formal company statement, all staff, mandatory attendance, CEO address regarding recent personnel matter. I accepted and spent the evening preparing for the compliance work ahead. Not because I needed preparation, because I wanted the documentation I filed to be so flawless that Bradley's incompetence would be thrown into even sharper contrast. The company-wide meeting happened at 9 a.m. the next morning. 47 participants connected, more than had witnessed my termination. Apparently, word had spread. Richard Holloway appeared on screen wearing a formal suit rather than his typical business casual. This was an official statement, and he was dressed accordingly. And there, visible in the frame behind him, sat Bradley Simmons, hands folded, face carefully neutral, looking like someone who'd been told to sit quietly and contemplate consequences. Richard began reading from a prepared statement, clearly written by legal counsel. Good morning. I am addressing the personnel matter that occurred yesterday regarding Lauren Castellano's employment termination. He paused. After thorough review, I need to clarify several things. First, the allegations of expense fraud were incorrect. The expenses in question were not only legitimate, but federally required under our Part 21 compliance obligations. Every item questioned represents mandatory activity we are legally obligated to perform. Another pause. Second, the termination decision was made without proper review of supporting documentation and without consultation with legal or operations regarding the nature of Lauren's work. This was a significant procedural failure. Bradley's jaw tightened visibly. Third, the public manner of the termination, conducted without prior investigation or opportunity for explanation, was inappropriate and contrary to company policy. Now came the part I'd demanded. On behalf of Vertex Aviation Systems, I formally apologize to Lauren Castellano for the wrongful termination, the public nature of the accusations, and the damage to her professional reputation. Lauren is a highly skilled compliance professional with an exemplary record. She deserved far better than what occurred. Richard looked directly into the camera. Lauren has agreed to support our compliance program as a consultant to ensure we meet our upcoming FAA review requirements. We're grateful for her professionalism given these circumstances. The meeting concluded with policy announcements about new termination procedures for compliance-related roles. Within hours, I received word through former colleagues Bradley Simmons had been placed on administrative leave. His exit package was being negotiated. The FAA review occurred 19 days later. Inspector Theodore Walsh, the same official who'd signed documentation during my Albuquerque audit, led the compliance examination. He spent 2 days reviewing files, interviewing personnel, and verifying our quality systems. The documentation I'd prepared as a consultant was flawless. Every signature verified, every timestamp authenticated, every requirement satisfied. He noted to Rebecca afterward that documentation quality had improved significantly from previous reviews. She made sure that comment reached me. The review passed without findings. Vertex's production approval certificate remained intact. But consequences continued unfolding. Bradley Simmons was terminated 4 days after his administrative leave began. Non-disparagement clauses prevented public discussion, but industry networks understood what had happened. The fine, $2.8 million, arrived 6 weeks later, not from the compliance review I'd salvaged, but from violations Bradley had created in other areas during his aggressive cost-cutting campaign. Documentation failures, training lapses, procedural shortcuts he'd encouraged without understanding regulatory requirements. His 3 weeks of leadership had created exposure that took months to fully assess. I completed my consulting engagement and formally joined Brennan and Mitchell as a partner. Derek helped me set up my new office. "So, the guy who called your expenses fraudulent is unemployed," he observed. "And you're a partner at a firm that specializes in helping companies avoid making the same mistakes. There's a certain symmetry. That's one word for it." Catherine scheduled me for speaking engagements almost immediately. Industry conferences, compliance training programs, presentations with titles like "The True Cost of Ignoring Expertise" and "When HR Doesn't Understand Regulatory Roles." I never named Vertex or Bradley directly. The industry knew exactly which situation I was describing. 18 months later, I received a LinkedIn message from Bradley Simmons himself. A long, rambling apology attempting to explain his mindset, acknowledge his mistakes, and demonstrate personal growth. I responded briefly, "I appreciate you reaching out. I hope you found a role where you can apply those lessons appropriately." Professional, measured, complete. The best revenge isn't explosive, it's structural. It's building a consulting practice on the rubble of someone else's incompetence. It's becoming the person companies call when they need to avoid creating situations like the one that launched your career. Bradley Simmons accused me of fraud over $1,800 in expenses he didn't understand. That accusation cost his company millions, ended his career, and made mine. 43 colleagues watched him terminate me on that Zoom call. Every single one of them watched the apology, too. And every time a company hires me now, at rates that would make Bradley's head spin, I remember that documentation protects you. Expertise matters, and incompetence eventually finds its appropriate consequences. If this connected with something in your own experience, if you've ever been publicly accused by someone who didn't understand your work, if you've ever watched documentation save you when accusations tried to destroy you, subscribe and become part of what we're building here. Every day we share experiences of people who proved that expertise eventually speaks louder than ignorance. Drop a comment telling me about a time your thorough documentation protected you when it mattered most. I read every single response. And check out that video right there, another experience you absolutely need to hear. Until next time, document everything, know your worth, and remember that the people who accuse you without evidence often become the cautionary tales you tell later.